Chosen one. If you found this message, it's not random. You didn't just click on this, you were led here. Because there is something about you that refuses to go down. You've been hit harder than most. Pressed longer than others. Stretched in ways you never asked for. And yet, you're still standing. Not untouched. Not unscarred. But standing. And heaven wants you to understand why. This message isn't hype. It's not spiritual entertainment. It's explanation. Because the power you carry is not common. It's not loud. It doesn't announce itself. It is rare. And rare things are not wasted. Scripture tells us in 2 Corinthians 4 verse 7. We have this treasure in jars of clay, to show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. You are the jar. But what heaven placed inside you, that's the treasure. You see, heaven does not pour rare power into weak vessels just to see if they break. Heaven pours it because the vessel was designed to survive pressure. That's why your life has felt heavier. That's why your trials weren't neat or explainable. Others broke where you bent. Others quit where you kept breathing. And sometimes you wondered, why me? Not because you were better, but because you were built for weight. Let's be honest. Some of the things you lived through should have ended you. Emotionally, mentally, spiritually. But they didn't. And here's the part most people don't understand. The enemy does not attack what carries no threat. Job 1 shows us something chilling. Satan couldn't touch Job without permission. And when permission was given, it wasn't because Job was weak. It was because Job was trusted. You were targeted because of what you carry, not because of what you lack. Heaven knew you could endure it. Hell feared what would happen if you did. Chosen one, listen carefully now, because this is where many misunderstand heaven. The world teaches dominance. Be louder. Be faster. Be stronger. Be seen. But heaven does not measure power the way the world does. The rarest power heaven entrusts to a human soul is not the ability to overpower others. It is the ability to remain whole while under pressure. Anyone can dominate when conditions are favorable. Anyone can look powerful when they're winning. But endurance? Endurance is different. Endurance is staying faithful when the applause stops. Endurance is holding your integrity when shortcuts are available. Endurance is continuing to love when bitterness would be easier. That kind of power cannot be taught. It cannot be faked. It can only be forged. And forging requires fire. You see, dominance demands attention. Endurance demands depth. Dominance wants control. Endurance submits to timing. Dominance is loud and immediate. Endurance is quiet and eternal. That's why heaven chose endurance as its rarest form of power. Because endurance changes realms. Think about this for a moment. The most defining moments in Scripture were not moments of domination. They were moments of endurance. Moses endured 40 years in obscurity before leadership. Joseph endured betrayal, false accusation, and prison before authority. David endured years of being hunted before wearing a crown. And Jesus endured rejection, silence, mockery, and the cross. Not because he lacked power, but because endurance was the vehicle through which power was released. Chosen one, this explains something about your life. You were not trained to overpower people. You were trained to outlast resistance. You weren't built to intimidate. You were built to remain standing when others fold. That's why your trials were not quick. That's why your deliverance wasn't instant. That's why your breakthrough took longer than you expected. Heaven was strengthening your core, not your image. There were moments when you begged for relief. Moments when you asked God to remove the weight. Moments when you questioned whether enduring was even worth it. And heaven was quiet, not because it was absent, but because something sacred was being formed inside you. Endurance is not passive. It is active trust under pressure. It is choosing to stay aligned when your emotions are screaming otherwise. It is refusing to become what hurt you. It is carrying pain without letting pain rewrite your identity. That is power. Rare power. Here's the part few people realize. Endurance creates spiritual authority that dominance never can. Because anyone can force obedience, but endurance inspires alignment. When you speak, people feel weight, not fear. When you stand, atmospheres shift, not because you demand it, but because you've survived what would have broken others. Your presence carries credibility. You didn't arrive untouched. You arrived tested. This is why you were allowed to feel weakness without being destroyed by it. Heaven was teaching you something profound. That power does not come from never falling. It comes from never losing your essence while rising again. You learn how to cry without quitting, how to question without abandoning faith, how to feel anger without becoming bitter. That balance, that restraint, that depth, that's endurance refined. And yes, there were times you felt embarrassed by how long things took. You watched others rise faster. You watched doors open for people who hadn't suffered half as much. You wondered if you were being overlooked. But heaven was not delaying you. Heaven was weight-proofing you. Because quick elevation without endurance destroys people. But endurance makes elevation sustainable. Chosen one, dominance impresses crowds. Endurance transforms generations. Dominance builds empires that collapse. Endurance builds foundations that last. That's why heaven invested so much time in you. That's why you were not rushed. That's why you were not spared. That's why you were not replaced. Because endurance cannot be mass-produced. It is rare. It is costly. And it is trusted only to those who can carry it without becoming corrupted. So when you look at your life and think, "Why did I have to endure so much?" Understand this. You weren't being punished. You were being prepared. Prepared to stand when others crumble. Prepared to lead without ego. Prepared to carry power without needing to prove it. And that is why you are still standing. Because heaven's rarest power isn't dominance. It's endurance. This part may sting, but it will heal. You were isolated not because you were rejected, but because you were being preserved. Galatians 1 verses 15 to 17 tells us Paul was pulled away before being revealed. You couldn't stay where others were comfortable. You couldn't blend in. You couldn't stay asleep. Not because you were difficult, but because your spirit wouldn't settle for shallow waters. Solitude refined you. Silence sharpened you. And yes, it hurt. But heaven was protecting the rare power growing inside you. Chosen one, this is where things get very real. Because heaven always leaves evidence. The rarest power is never hidden without traces. It leaves marks on your life, patterns in your story, fingerprints on your spirit. These are not personality traits. These are not coincidences. They are signs. And as you listen, don't force anything. Just notice what resonates. There were seasons that should have destroyed your faith. Moments that should have hardened your heart. Losses that should have permanently altered who you are. And yet, here you are. Not untouched, but still you. You felt the pain fully. You didn't numb yourself. You didn't pretend it didn't hurt. But somehow, you didn't stay broken. That's not emotional toughness. That's not denial. That's spiritual elasticity, the ability to bend without shattering. Most people fracture under prolonged pressure. You adapted, healed, and reassembled. That ability to recover is not natural. It's a sign of rare reinforcement from heaven. This one is subtle, but powerful. You've been exhausted, worn down, mentally and emotionally stretched. But something inside you refuses to become cruel. You didn't turn cold. You didn't lose compassion. You didn't start mocking what you once believed in. You questioned, but you didn't mock. You rested, but you didn't rot. Cynicism is what happens when pain kills hope. The fact that you still hope, even quietly, even cautiously, even after disappointment. That's rare power. Because endurance doesn't just survive pain, it protects the heart. Have you noticed this? People open up to you unexpectedly. They tell you things they didn't plan to say. They trust you with truths they hide from others. And you didn't demand it. You didn't probe. You didn't manipulate. Your presence disarms defenses. That's not charisma. That's not curiosity. That's spiritual safety. Endurance produces depth, and depth creates trust. People can sense you've survived darkness without becoming dangerous. That's rare. Almost gave up on life. Almost walked away from faith. Almost became someone you promised yourself you wouldn't be. Almost. Your story is full of narrow escapes. Moments where one decision could have changed everything. One night. One breakdown. One wrong turn. But something intervened. Sometimes it was strength. Sometimes it was exhaustion that saved you from doing something permanent. Sometimes it was a quiet inner voice that said, "Not this way." You weren't lucky. You were anchored. Heaven doesn't let rare power disappear easily. This one sets you apart. You don't crave attention the way others do. You don't need constant validation. You don't feel empty when you're unnoticed. You can work in silence. Grow in obscurity. Heal without announcing it. That doesn't mean you lack confidence. It means your identity is rooted, not reactive. Rare power doesn't need an audience. It knows timing matters more than recognition. At times you feel heavy, and you can't explain why. You sense things before they happen. You feel burdened for people, situations, even generations. You carry concern deeper than logic allows. You're affected by injustice, brokenness, and spiritual imbalance. That's not anxiety. That's intercessory wiring. Endurance carriers are often load bearers. Not because they asked to be, but because heaven knew they wouldn't collapse under it. This is crucial. You didn't erase your past. You didn't pretend trauma never happened. You didn't rewrite your story to sound prettier. You absorbed the lessons. You grew wiser without becoming bitter. Stronger without becoming arrogant. Softer without becoming weak. Pain didn't define you, but it deepened you. That's endurance at its highest form. Even when you're tired. Even when you want to quit. Even when no one is watching. Something inside you says, "Stay." Not loudly. Not forcefully. Just steadily. You don't stand because it's easy. You stand because it feels necessary. That's not pressure. That's calling. You've walked away from environments, relationships, and versions of yourself. But not in rage. Not in contempt. You left with clarity. You didn't burn bridges, you crossed rivers. That level of emotional maturity comes from endurance, not ego. It means you've learned to move forward without dragging resentment behind you. This is the clearest sign of all. After everything, you're still breathing, still believing, still becoming. Not closed, not hardened, not numb, still open, still standing. That is heaven's rarest power at work in you. Chosen one, if several of these signs pierced your spirit, understand this. You were not just surviving. You were being trusted. Trusted with endurance. Trusted with weight. Trusted with time. And heaven does not entrust rare power lightly. Why you are still standing when others fell? Because heaven anchored you. Isaiah 54 verse 17 says, "No weapon formed against you shall prosper." Notice it doesn't say weapons won't form. They formed. They struck. They hurt. But they did not finish you. You were reinforced in unseen places. When others collapsed publicly, you were strengthened privately. And now, you're standing as proof. Hear this clearly. You are not still standing just to keep surviving. You are standing because you are being positioned. The endurance season trained you. The isolation season refined you. The pain season deepened you. Now comes the assignment. The rare power you carry isn't for display. It's for impact. Quiet impact. Precise impact. Eternal impact. Chosen one. Pause for a moment. Take a breath you don't rush. Let your shoulders drop. Let your spirit come back into your body. This part is not information. It's confirmation. You don't need to analyze this. You don't need to figure it out. You only need to receive it. You are still standing not because you were spared pain, but because you were strengthened beneath it. Some people survived because life was gentle. You survived because heaven was deliberate. There were nights you didn't think you would make it through. Days when getting out of bed felt like warfare. Seasons when your prayers were short because your strength was gone. And still, you stood. Not loudly, not triumphantly, but faithfully. That matters more than you know. You may not see it yet, but your endurance has already spoken for you. In rooms you haven't entered. In futures you haven't imagined. In moments where your story will quietly give someone else permission to keep going. You didn't endure for nothing. Nothing was wasted. Not the delays. Not the tears. Not the confusion. Not even the silence. Especially not the silence. Hear this gently. You were never weak for needing time. You were never behind for moving slowly. You were never forgotten for being hidden. You were being rooted. So that when life tried again, and it did, you wouldn't be uprooted. And you weren't. You don't have to force your next step. You don't have to rush your healing. You don't have to explain your journey to anyone who wasn't there. Your standing is enough for now. Presence before performance. Stillness before movement. Depth before display. Heaven is not in a hurry with you. And if no one has told you this clearly, let it land now. You did well. You did not quit when quitting made sense. You did not harden when hardening would have protected you. You did not become smaller to survive. You stayed true. That is rare. That is honored. That is seen. So receive this slowly. You are not barely holding on. You are held. You are not late. You are aligned. You are not overlooked. You are being positioned. And the same power that kept you standing in the storm will steady you in the season ahead. No rushing. No striving. No fear. Just stand. Heaven knows exactly why you're still here. If this message touched your heart, and you feel guided, please like this video. And you can support the channel through the link in the channel's bio. Even your $1 is very precious for me and this channel. Your kindness helps us continue spreading light and love. God bless you.